Cold water ran over my trembling hands. Dish soap smelled sharply like artificial lemons, masking something rotten underneath. My phone vibrated against wet marble. An unknown number flashed. A raspy voice whispered an impossible command. "Come alone. Keep your mouth shut." Panic tasted like copper. We built a quiet, perfect life. Or so I believed. Truth festers in dark corners, waiting for someone to drag it into daylight. Now I am walking straight into a monster's open jaws. The sponge in my hand was breaking apart. Small yellow crumbs of foam drifted in the greasy dishwater, circling the drain in a slow, pathetic vortex. I scrubbed the edge of the frying pan until my knuckles ached, breathing in the sharp, chemical scent of lemon palmolive. It was Thursday night. It was meatloaf night. It was a night so aggressively ordinary that the sudden violent vibration of my phone on the kitchen counter felt like a physical strike. I wiped my wet hands on my jeans, leaving dark, damp streaks on the denim. The caller ID was a string of digits with a local area code, but nothing I recognized. Usually I let those ring out. Spam risks, telemarketers. But my finger hovered, and an irritating twitch in my stomach pushed me to swipe accept. I lifted the phone to my ear. "Faye," a voice said. It wasn't a question. It was a heavy, gravel-scraped statement of fact. There was no background noise, no hum of traffic or office chatter. Just the hollow, dead air of a secure line. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice dropping instinctively to a hushed tone. "My name is Vincent." The name didn't mean anything to me. Not initially. Vincent could have been the man who fixed our roof last spring, or the new junior partner at Thomas's logistics firm. But the tone, tired, flat, and absolute, carried a weight that didn't belong to roofers or junior partners. "I don't know a Vincent," I said. I looked over my shoulder. Beyond the kitchen archway, the living room was bathed in the flickering blue light of the television. Thomas was slouched on the sofa, wearing his faded grey college sweatshirt, one arm draped lazily over the back cushion. He was watching a documentary about deep-sea fishing. I could hear the narrator droning on about trawler nets. "You don't need to know me, Faye. You just need to know that I have 4 cameras pointed at your house right now. One on the front porch, one on the driveway, 2 covering the backyard. Don't look out the window." My breath hitched. My eyes darted toward the window above the sink, but the glass only reflected my own pale, terrified face staring back at me. A damp strand of hair was plastered to my cheek. "What do you want?" My voice cracked. It wasn't a defiant demand. It was a pathetic, fearful squeak. I hated myself for it immediately. "I have a video," Vincent said, his voice maddeningly slow. "You need to see the footage. It's about Thomas. I'm sending you an address. Come alone. Don't tell your husband. If he gets in that car with you, or if he even touches his phone to make a call before you leave, I'll have my men burn the house down with both of you inside." "Wait, The line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the muffled sound of the television and the steady drip of the kitchen faucet. Drip, drip, drip. I stared at the phone. My palm was sweating, making the glass back of the device slick. A second later, a text message pinged. It was an address. Southside, the industrial park down by the old rail yards. A rational person would have called the police. A hero would have marched into the living room, slammed the phone down in front of her husband, and demanded answers. But I wasn't rational, and I certainly wasn't a hero. I was a 34-year-old archivist who got anxious when the grocery store rearranged the cereal aisle. And yet, there was a heavy, dark stone of doubt sitting at the bottom of my stomach. It had been there for months, maybe years. The locked drawer in Thomas's home office. The times he came home smelling not of his generic sandalwood aftershave, but of industrial bleach and cold sweat. The sudden, unexplained influxes of cash that he passed off as unexpected quarterly bonuses. I had ignored all of it. I had built a comfortable, willfully blind life. I walked into the living room. My legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. Thomas didn't look away from the TV. "Who was on the phone?" he asked, popping a pretzel into his mouth. The crunch sounded abnormally loud. Just the pharmacy." I lied. The words tasted like ash. "They messed up my sister's prescription. Chloe is losing her mind over it. I told her I'd run down and sort it out for her." It was a sloppy lie. Chloe lived 40 minutes away. If the pharmacy messed up, she would handle it herself. But I needed an excuse to leave the house immediately, and my brain was misfiring. Thomas finally turned his head. His eyes, a soft, pale blue, settled on me. He chewed the pretzel slowly. There was nothing menacing about his face. He had a slight overbite, a receding hairline, and a small shaving nick on his jaw. He looked so incredibly, painfully boring. "Now?" he asked. "It's pouring outside." "I know, but you know how she gets." I forced a dry, rigid smile. "I'll be quick." He stared at me for a second longer than comfortable. My pulse hammered against my ribs. "He knows." My brain screamed. "He sees right through you." Then Thomas shrugged and turned back to the TV. "All right, drive safe. Grab some of those peanut butter cups from the gas station on your way back, will you?" "Sure." I turned away before he could see my face completely crumble. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, my fingers fumbling blindly with the fabric. I shoved my feet into my rain boots, snagging the zipper on my jeans. Every movement felt disjointed, clumsy. As I opened the front door, the cold, damp air hit my face, smelling of wet asphalt and dead earth. I didn't look at the trees. I didn't look for the cameras. I just kept my head down, power-walked to my 10-year-old Honda sedan, and got in. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered before catching, shaking the entire frame. I backed out of the driveway, my eyes glued to the rear-view mirror. Thomas was just a shadow through the living room window, a silhouette against the blue glow of the television. I wondered, with a sudden, nauseating lurch in my gut, if I would ever see him exactly like that again. The drive to the south side took 23 minutes. I counted every single one of them. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, overwhelming my windshield wipers. They dragged across the glass with a high-pitched, rubbery squeal that grated on my exposed nerves. The heater was blasting, pushing dry, suffocating air into my face, smelling vaguely of burnt dust and old oil. I kept trying to logic my way out of the panic. "It's a scam," I told myself. "Someone got our information off a breached database. They're going to ask me for crypto or wire transfers. It's extortion. But extortionists usually didn't tell you to leave your husband at home. They didn't tell you to drive to an abandoned industrial park at 8 o'clock at night." The GPS directed me off the main avenue and down a poorly lit side street, flanked by chain-link fences and skeletal remains of old factories. The road was a patchwork of potholes and cracked asphalt. My headlights washed over rusted dumpsters and piles of waterlogged cardboard. "Your destination is on the right," the robotic voice from my phone announced brightly, a jarring contrast to the desolation outside. I pulled over to the curb. The building was an old bowling alley. The sign above the doors was completely dark, the plastic lettering shattered. The facade was covered in peeling, faded turquoise paint. It looked entirely abandoned, except for a heavy black SUV parked near the side entrance. The engine was off, but I could see the faint red glow of a cigarette ember from the driver's side window. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my joints locked. "Just turn around!" A rational voice pleaded in my head. "Drive to the police station, go!" but the image of the 4 invisible cameras around my house paralyzed me. I couldn't risk it. I turned off the ignition. The sudden absence of engine noise made the drumming of the rain on the roof sound like a firing squad. I pushed the door open and stepped out. Immediately, my right foot sank ankle-deep into a hidden pothole filled with freezing, muddy water. It breached the top of my boot. The frigid water soaked instantly through my cotton sock, wrapping my foot in a suffocating, icy grip. "Damn it!" I hissed, a pathetic, frustrated tear hot against my cold cheek. It was such a small, stupid inconvenience, but it broke whatever fragile facade of cinematic bravery I had tried to build during the drive. I wasn't a hard-boiled heroine stepping into danger. I was a terrified wife with a freezing, wet sock, shivering violently in the rain. I hobbled toward the heavy glass double doors of the bowling alley. One of them was propped open with a rusted cinder block. I slipped inside. The air in the building was stagnant. It smelled heavily of ozone, decades-old floor wax, and the stale, yeasty ghost of spilled beer. Emergency lights provided a weak, sickly yellow illumination, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty laminate of the bowling lanes. The ball returns looked like the skeletal spines of dead metal beasts. "Keep walking toward lane 12. A voice echoed from the shadows. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I couldn't see the speaker. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief second, took a shaky breath that tasted like dust, and began to walk. The squelch of my wet right foot echoed loudly in the cavernous space. Squeak, squelch, squeak, squelch. It completely ruined any dignity I had left. As I approached the middle of the building, the shadows parted. 2 men were standing near the seating area of lane 12. They didn't look like movie gangsters. They weren't wearing tailored Italian suits. They wore heavy, dark tactical jackets and jeans. One was chewing gum with a slack jaw. The other was casually picking at his fingernails. They looked immensely, violently bored. Sitting in a molded plastic chair directly on the wood of the lane was a man I assumed was Vincent. He had a folding card table set up in front of him, and on it sat a thick, ruggedized laptop. Next to the laptop was a cheap styrofoam cup of coffee. He was in his late 40s, with thick hair graying aggressively at the temples. He wore a dark wool overcoat that looked expensive, but it was unbuttoned and wrinkled, as if he had slept in it. His face was lined, heavy with exhaustion, and the skin around his eyes was stained the color of bruised plums. He had a faint, jagged scar tracing the edge of his jawline, not a clean slice, but something uneven, like a bad burn. He didn't stand when I approached. He didn't even look up immediately. He just took a slow sip from the styrofoam cup, swallowed, and let out a long breath. "You're late," he said. His voice was quieter in person, lacking the static of the phone, but it carried the same heavy, immovable weight. The rain," I stammered. I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to stop the violent shivering. And I stepped in a puddle. Vincent finally looked up. His eyes were a flat, opaque brown. He stared at me for a long moment, taking in my wet hair, my cheap raincoat, and my trembling posture. There was no pity in his gaze. There wasn't even amusement. He looked at me the way one might look at a rusted bolt that needed to be unscrewed. An obstacle, a tool, nothing more. "Faye," he said softly, "sit down." He gestured to an identical plastic chair on the opposite side of the folding table. I moved toward it stiffly, my wet foot squelching. I sat. The plastic was freezing against my legs through my jeans. "Who are you?" I asked. I was aiming for demanding, but it came out pleading. "What do you want with my husband? I am a man who owns a great deal of the shipping infrastructure in this city." Vincent said slowly, The docks, the warehouses, the unions. I move things. Your husband, Thomas, is a logistics consultant for a firm that frequently audits my shipments. We have had a working relationship for 3 years. Thomas is an accountant. I interrupted, desperate to correct him, desperate to drag the conversation back to a reality I understood. He does spreadsheets. He gets stressed out if we run out of printer ink. You have the wrong person. Vincent didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached out and turned the heavy laptop around so the screen faced me. I don't make mistakes about who owes me, Faye, Vincent said, the weariness in his voice deepening. And I don't make mistakes about who steals from me. But stealing is a business problem. I can fix a business problem. What your husband did last night, that was personal. He reached out and tapped the spacebar. The screen blinked, and the nightmare began. The footage was grainy, shot in high contrast black and white. A timestamp in the bottom right corner flickered. October 14th, 2:14:33. It was early this morning, 2 a.m. The camera angle was high, looking down on what appeared to be the interior of a massive, empty shipping warehouse. Stacks of wooden pallets sat in the background. Puddles of water on the concrete floor reflected the harsh, overhead security lights. A heavy metal door on the left side of the screen scraped open. 2 men walked in. Or rather, 1 man walked in, dragging the other by the collar of his jacket. The man being dragged had his hands bound behind his back with thick zip ties. He was stumbling, his face bloodied, his head lolling as if he were barely conscious. The man doing the dragging wore a dark, cheap raincoat. The hood was pulled down. Look closely, Vincent murmured over the hum of the laptop fan. I leaned forward. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my throat. I didn't need to see the face clearly. I knew the posture. I knew the slight slump of the shoulders, the heavy, flat-footed stride, the way his left arm swung a little wider than his right. It was the same stride that walked down our hallway every morning to fetch the newspaper. It was the same posture that slouched over the kitchen island while drinking coffee. It was Thomas. My stomach performed a slow, sickening rollover. A bitter rush of saliva flooded the back of my mouth, tasting of pennies and bile. No, I whispered. It was a pathetic, useless sound. On screen, Thomas shoved the bound man to his knees. The man fell hard against the concrete, his shoulders jerking awkwardly. Thomas stood over him. He didn't look frantic. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely methodical, like a man assessing a broken lawn mower. The man on the ground. Vincent's voice cut through the silence of the room, dry and devoid of inflection. Is my nephew, Leo. He manages the inventory at this particular facility. He caught your husband doctoring a shipping manifest. $2 million worth of pharmaceuticals, diverted onto a ghost truck. Leo confronted him. I couldn't look away from the screen. My eyes were burning, completely unblinking. On the video, Thomas reached into his coat. For a brief, desperate second, my shattered mind hoped he was pulling out a phone, a radio, a bribe. Instead, he pulled out a heavy industrial steel pipe. It looked like a piece of scaffolding, maybe 2 feet long. The bound man, Leo, looked up. Even through the poor resolution, I could see his mouth moving frantically, begging, pleading. Thomas didn't say a word. He didn't hesitate. He raised the heavy steel pipe and brought it down on the side of Leo's head. There was no audio on the footage, but my brain supplied the sound perfectly. The sickening, wet crack of bone giving way. The heavy thud of the pipe meeting resistance. Leo's body collapsed instantly, folding in on itself like a dropped marionette. I violently clapped both hands over my mouth to hold back a scream, but a choked, guttural sob ripped through my throat anyway. The smell of the bowling alley, the stale beer, the ozone, suddenly became suffocating. I closed my eyes, but the afterimage was burned into the back of my eyelids. "Open your eyes, Faye!" Vincent's voice wasn't loud, but it commanded obedience like a whip crack. "What's your husband?" I forced my eyes open. Tears blurred my vision, turning the screen into a smudge of grey and black. Thomas hit him again, and again, the methodical, rhythmic swing of his arm. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was an extermination. It was pest control. After the fourth strike, Thomas stepped back. He calmly looked down at the ruined mess on the floor. He wiped a speck of something off his cheek with the back of his wrist. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and started typing with his thumbs. October 14th, 2:18:10. My mind flashed back to last night. I had been asleep. I woke up around 2:30 to use the bathroom and saw a text from Thomas. Working late. Server crashed at the office. Be home by 4. Love you. The hands that had typed those words were literally covered in the blood of the man he had just crushed to death. Vincent reached over and slammed the laptop shut. The sharp clack of plastic hitting plastic made me flinch so hard my chair scraped backward against the wood of the lane. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. I dropped my hands to my lap. My entire body was trembling uncontrollably now. Not from the cold, from the sheer, unadulterated horror of the stranger sleeping in my bed. The man who complained about my burnt meatloaf. The man who sorted our recycling into separate bins to save the planet. I leaned over the side of the plastic chair and dry heaved, violently. Nothing came up but a string of acidic spit that landed on the dusty wooden floor. I gasped for air, wiping my mouth with a trembling, damp sleeve. Neither of Vincent's men moved. Vincent didn't flinch. He just watched me with those dead, exhausted eyes. "He's a monster!" I choked out, my voice ragged, barely a whisper. He's not Thomas. He is exactly Thomas. Vincent corrected quietly. He is a sociopath who thought he was smarter than the people he was stealing from. He covered his digital tracks well. He burned the ledger. And when Leo caught him in the physical act, he killed him to sever the only loose end. Vincent picked up his styrofoam cup, swirled the dregs of the coffee, and took a sip. "I want him dead, Faye." The words hung in the dusty air, as plain and undeniable as the rain hammering on the roof. He said it with the casual certainty of ordering lunch. "Then kill him!" I gasped, wiping another string of saliva from my chin. "If you know he did it, if you have the video, why are you showing me this? Go to my house and shoot him. Call the cops. I don't care. He's not my husband anymore." A slow, bitter smile touched the corner of Vincent's mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. "If I could send a crew to your house and put a bullet in his head, I wouldn't be sitting in a damp bowling alley talking to a terrified archivist with wet shoes," Vincent said. "Thomas isn't stupid. He knows I'm looking for the leak. He knows I'm hunting the man who killed Leo. Since he got home this morning, he has a private security detail watching his every move. Hired guns, ex-military. 4 men in an unmarked van parked 2 streets over from your house." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the layers of deceit. Security detail, ex-military. "If my men make a move on the house, it becomes a war in a suburban neighborhood." Vincent continued. "The police get involved. The feds get involved. I lose my shipping lanes. I lose my business. I can't touch him while he's guarded, and he hasn't left the house without them." Vincent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the folding table. The smell of peppermint and stale tobacco drifted across the plastic surface. "But you, Faye," Vincent whispered. "He trusts you. He thinks you are completely, blissfully blind. He thinks you're the stupid, safe little wife who will believe any lie he feeds you." I felt a hot flush of shame burn through the cold terror in my chest. He was right. I was that wife. I need him out of that house, away from his guards, in a location of my choosing. Vincent said softly, "And you are going to bring him to me." "No," I whispered, instinctively pushing back against the chair. "No, I can't. If he figures it out." "If you don't," Vincent interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, losing the weariness and adopting a cold, hard edge of steel. "I will bypass the guards. I will send a team with thermite. They will burn your house to the foundation. Thomas will die. You will die. And I will sleep very, very well." He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a small, disposable flip phone, sliding it across the table until it touched my trembling hand. "Take the phone. Go home," Vincent commanded. "Look your husband in the eyes. Smile at him. Tell him the pharmacy lines were long. Sleep in the same bed with the man who crushed my nephew's skull. I will call you tomorrow with instructions on where to bring him." I stared at the black plastic phone. It looked like a grenade with the pin pulled. "And Faye," Vincent added, leaning back in his chair, "if you run, I will find you before you reach the county line. The cameras at your house are real. Remember that when you walk up the driveway." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been entirely burned out of me, replaced by a hollow, ringing terror. I picked up the phone, the cheap plastic scraping against my frozen fingers. I stood up, my wet sock squelching against the wood, and turned my back on the monster in the shadows, knowing I was driving home to a much, much worse one. The neon sign of the Exxon station buzzed with a frantic, dying electrical hum. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, staring at the bright, artificial interior of the convenience store. Rain drummed steadily on my windshield. My right foot was completely numb. The wet sock had turned into a block of ice inside my boot. "Grab some of those peanut butter cups." His voice echoed in my head, casual and mildly demanding. It was a perfectly normal request from a husband on a Thursday night. But now, the thought of buying him candy felt like a grotesque parody of my life. I was supposed to be the dutiful wife, fetching snacks for the man who, hours earlier, had swung a steel pipe into another human being's skull until it cracked like porcelain. I shoved the car into park and forced myself out into the rain. Inside the store, the air smelled aggressively of cheap pine cleaner and rolling hot dogs. A teenager with severe acne and a name tag that read, "Gary" didn't look up from his phone as I walked past the counter. I moved down the candy aisle. My hands were shaking so badly I knocked a row of chocolate bars off the shelf. They hit the linoleum floor with a dull thud. I stared at them for a long time. Lacking the motor skills to bend down and pick them up, I grabbed a twin pack of peanut butter cups. The bright orange wrapper felt slippery in my sweaty palm. I paid with a crumpled $5 bill from my coat pocket. I didn't wait for the change. The drive the rest of the way home was a blank spot in my memory. I don't remember the turns or the stoplights. I only remember the crippling paranoia as I turned onto our street. 4 cameras, Vincent had said. 1 on the front porch, 1 on the driveway. I pulled into our driveway. The house looked exactly as it had an hour ago. The porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow against the beige siding. The lawn was neatly manicured. It was a house that belonged on a postcard for suburban mediocrity. Somewhere out there in the dark, lenses were watching me. And 2 streets over, heavily armed men in an unmarked van were guarding my husband. I turned off the car. I sat in the dark for 3 full minutes, practicing how to breathe. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. My chest felt tight, constricted by an invisible band of panic. I picked up the orange candy wrapper from the passenger seat. I slipped the heavy black burner phone into the deep pocket of my raincoat, burying it under a crumpled tissue. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. "Faye!" Thomas called out from the living room. "Yeah, it's me." I said. My voice sounded thin, reedy. I cleared my throat, forcing a cough to cover it up. Sorry it took so long. The weather is awful. I kicked off my boots by the door, wincing as my freezing right foot hit the hardwood floor. I hung up my coat, acutely aware of the weight of the burner phone pulling the fabric down on one side. Thomas walked into the hallway. He was holding an empty glass. He looked at my damp hair and my pale face, his brow furrowing slightly. "You look freezing," he said. He reached out. I saw his hand moving toward my face in slow motion. The knuckles were slightly raw, a faint reddish tint against his pale skin. The recoil. My brain screamed. That's from the vibration of the pipe hitting bone. His fingers brushed a wet strand of hair away from my cheek. His skin was warm. The contrast between his warm, gentle touch and the cold, dead eyes I had seen on the laptop screen triggered a violent physical reaction. My stomach pitched. I managed to suppress the flinch, but I couldn't stop my jaw from clenching tight enough to grind my molars. "I'm fine," I managed to say, forcing a weak smile. I held up the orange wrapper like a shield. "Got your candy?" Thomas smiled. It was his genuine, boyish smile, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're a lifesaver. Chloe get her pills sorted?" "Yes," I lied, looking directly into his pale blue eyes. It was terrifying how easily the words slipped out. I was adapting to the rot. She was just being dramatic. As usual. "Well, glad you're back." He leaned in and kissed my forehead. I held my breath, smelling the faint trace of his sandalwood aftershave mixed with something metallic. Iron. Blood. Or maybe it was just my imagination, poisoning my senses. He turned and walked back towards the kitchen to put his glass away. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, staring at his back. I watched the way his shoulders moved. I watched his hands. I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that I was sharing a house with a predator perfectly disguised as prey. And the worst part was, he had no idea I was the trap closing around him. I did not sleep. I lay rigid on the far edge of the mattress, facing the window. The rain had stopped around 3 a.m, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in the bedroom. Thomas slept soundly beside me. He didn't toss. He didn't turn. He breathed with a slow, even rhythm that mocked the frantic, irregular hammering of my own heart. Every time I closed my eyes, the grainy black and white footage replayed on the back of my eyelids. The wet crack, the violent jerk of Leo's body, the casual swipe of Thomas's wrist wiping blood from his face. I kept my hand buried under my pillow, resting my fingers against the hard plastic shell of the burner phone. It was my only tether to reality, the only proof that I hadn't lost my mind. At 6:30, Thomas's alarm beeped. He reached over and silenced it immediately. He sat up, stretched, and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I croaked. I didn't turn around. He padded off to the bathroom. The shower turned on. I lay there listening to the water running through the pipes. I wondered if he was scrubbing his knuckles. I wondered if he looked at himself in the mirror and saw the same boring accountant I had seen for 7 years, or if he finally let the mask slip when he was alone. By the time I dragged myself out of bed, he was already in the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the house, rich and inviting. It was an offensive scent. It felt wrong that the morning smelled so normal. I walked into the kitchen wearing my thickest fleece robe, tying the belt tight against the chill that had settled permanently in my bones. Thomas was standing at the stove, wearing crisp slacks and a pressed blue dress shirt. He was scrambling eggs in a non-stick pan, pushing the bright yellow curds around with a wooden spatula. "Toast is almost done," he said over his shoulder. I sat down at the kitchen island. I folded my hands together in my lap to hide their trembling. I'm not really hungry. He turned off the burner and slid the eggs onto 2 plates. You need to eat, Faye. You're pale. You didn't sleep well. He placed a plate in front of me. The eggs were perfectly cooked, light and fluffy. 2 pieces of sourdough toast popped up from the toaster. The edge of one was slightly burnt, filling the air with a bitter, charred scent that instantly made my stomach roil. I'm fine, just a headache, I said. Thomas sat down across from me. He buttered his toast with methodical, even strokes. Work is going to be crazy today. End of the month audits. I might have to stay late again. Working late. The excuse he used when he was doctoring shipping manifests. The excuse he used when he was burying a steel pipe into a man's head. Okay, I said quietly. I picked up my fork and pushed the eggs around the plate, trying to mimic his casual demeanor. Do you ever get stressed, Tom, with the audits? It seems like a lot of pressure. He paused, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, his eyes studying my face with a sudden, sharp intensity. For a second, the boring accountant vanished, and something cold and calculating flickered behind his pupils. It's just numbers, Faye, he said smoothly. Numbers are easy. They do what you tell them to do. You just have to make sure the columns balance. He took a bite of his toast. The crunch was loud in the quiet kitchen. Before I could force a response, a sharp, aggressive vibration buzzed against my thigh. I froze. I had slipped the burner phone into the pocket of my fleece robe. I hadn't expected Vincent to call this early. Thomas stopped chewing. He looked down at my lap, then back up at my face. Was that your phone? He asked. My real phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, entirely silent. No, I lied smoothly, the adrenaline injecting a sudden, desperate clarity into my brain. It was the washing machine. It's been doing that off-balance spin thing again, making the floor vibrate. Thomas looked toward the laundry room door down the hall. He chewed slowly, swallowing the toast. I'll take a look at it this weekend. Remind me. I will. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, stood up, and carried his plate to the sink. He rinsed it, the water washing away the remnants of his breakfast just as easily as the industrial bleach had washed away whatever stains he brought home last night. I have to go, he said, picking up his briefcase. He leaned over and kissed the top of my head. Love you. Take some aspirin for that headache. Love you too. I whispered to the countertop. I listened to his footsteps walk to the front door. I listened to the door open and close. I waited until I heard the engine of his car start and back out of the driveway. I waited until the sound faded completely down the street. Then I pulled the burner phone out of my pocket. The cheap green screen was illuminated. Missed call. 1 new message. I opened the text. 1400 hours. The old Miller property. Get him there. Call me when it's done. The Miller property was a dilapidated hunting cabin Thomas had inherited from his grandfather. It was 40 miles outside the city limits, situated at the end of a long, unpaved logging road. No cell service, no neighbors, thick woods, and a deep, murky lake. It was entirely isolated. His security detail wouldn't be able to blend in or hide in a suburban van out there. They would be exposed or left behind entirely if I played this right. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island. The marble was cold against my palms. I was going to send my husband into the woods to die. By noon, my nerves were frayed to a bleeding edge. I had paced the length of the living room so many times the soles of my slippers felt thin. I practiced the lie out loud to the empty house, tweaking my tone, adjusting the pitch of my voice to sound distressed, but not hysterical. At 12:30, I picked up my real phone and dialed Thomas's office number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Thomas speaking." His professional voice. Crisp, impatient. "Tom, it's me." I injected a slight tremor into my words, pressing a hand flat against my chest to monitor my own heartbeat. "Faye, what's wrong? You sound upset." "I just got off the phone with Mr. Henderson," I said, leaning heavily into the fiction. Mr. Henderson was the elderly neighbor who lived 2 miles down the road from the Miller cabin. We barely spoke to him, but he was the only set of eyes out there. He was driving his tractor past the property line. He said there's water flooding out from under the front door of the cabin. "What?" Thomas's voice dropped, tightening with immediate annoyance. "Damn it, the old copper pipes! I told you we should have drained the system before the first freeze." I know, it's my fault," I babbled, playing the anxious, apologetic wife perfectly. It made me sick how easy it was to manipulate his view of me. "He said it looks bad, Tom. Like ruining the floorboards bad. I don't know where the main shut-off valve is." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. The sound of a man inconvenienced by domestic trivialities. "Fine. Did you call a plumber? Out there, on a Friday afternoon? It's going to be an emergency call-out fee, plus mileage. They quoted me $800 just to look at it." I knew Thomas hated spending money on things he believed he could fix himself with a wrench and a YouTube tutorial. His arrogance was his primary vulnerability. "Jesus, cancel them!" Thomas snapped. "I'll go out there and shut the water off from the main line. We can assess the damage and call someone next week." "Are you sure? What about your audits?" "They can wait," he muttered. "I'll head out now. I should be there in an hour." "I'll come with you," I said quickly. "I can help mop up the water while you find the valve." There was a brief pause. "No, stay home. You said you had a headache." "I took some aspirin. I feel better." I pressed, keeping my voice light but insistent. "Besides, if the floors are warped, we'll need to take pictures for the insurance. My phone has the better camera. Please, Tom, let me help. I feel awful that I forgot to remind you to drain the pipes." Another sigh, followed by the sound of him shuffling papers. "Fine, but I'm not driving all the way home to pick you up. Meet me there. Take the Honda." "Okay, see you there." I hung up. My reflection stared back at me in the dark screen of the phone. I looked exactly the same as I had yesterday. My hair was tied back in a messy bun. I was wearing an oversized sweater and faded jeans, but the woman in the reflection was a stranger. She was a woman who had just successfully arranged a hit. I picked up the burner phone and dialed the only contact saved in it. Vincent answered on the first ring. He didn't say hello. "It's done," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, dead whisper. "He's heading to the Miller property. He should be there by 1:30. "Is he bringing his shadows?" Vincent asked. The gravel in his voice was thick. "He's driving straight from his office," I replied, staring blankly at the kitchen wall. "He thinks it's a plumbing emergency. His security detail sits in a van near our house. They don't follow him into the corporate parking garage, and they won't expect him to leave in the middle of the day for the woods." "Good. I'm meeting him there," I added, my throat tightening. Silence stretched over the secure line. When Vincent finally spoke, his tone lacked the cold business edge it usually carried. It was almost observant. "That is a risk, Faye. You don't need to be there for the cleanup. If I don't show up, he'll know something is wrong," I said. "He'll get suspicious. He might leave before you get there. I have to be the bait." "Very well." A pause. "Do exactly what I tell you. When you pull up to the cabin, park your car facing the road. Leave the keys in the ignition. Do not go inside with him. Tell him you need to get the camera out of the trunk. Give my men 30 seconds after he steps through the front door." "And then?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "And then you get in your car, drive away, and you never look in your rearview mirror." Vincent hung up. I stood alone in the kitchen. The faint smell of burnt sourdough was still lingering in the air. I walked to the front door, put on my boots, and grabbed my car keys. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly, terrifyingly still. The panic had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. I walked out to the Honda, the gravel crunching under my boots. I didn't look for the cameras. I didn't care about them anymore. I got in the car, turned the key, and started driving toward the woods. The transition from city pavement to the rural county roads felt like crossing a physical border into a different reality. The further I drove from the suburban grid, the more the landscape deteriorated into overgrown ditches, rusted barbed wire fences, and dense, suffocating walls of pine trees. The rain had completely stopped, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy purple, pressing down on the canopy. My 10-year-old Honda rattled violently as the asphalt gave way to the deeply rutted gravel of the logging road leading to the Miller property. The suspension groaned over every pothole. My hands were clamped to the steering wheel at 10 and 2, my knuckles entirely white. The heater was blowing dry, stale air directly into my face, smelling of old dust and the faint, sweet decay of antifreeze. It was suffocating, but I didn't roll down the window. I didn't want to hear the silence of the woods. 4 miles down the dirt road, the trees finally broke, revealing the dark, glassy surface of the lake. It looked like a massive pool of spilled oil, perfectly still and completely opaque. Nestled on the bank, 50 yards from the water's edge, was the cabin. It was a small, ugly structure built in the late 70s. The dark green shingles were peeling, curled at the edges like dead leaves. The wooden porch sagged in the middle. There was no flood. The ground beneath the front door was composed of dry, packed dirt and dead pine needles. I pulled the Honda into the small clearing that served as a driveway. I remembered Vincent's instructions. Park your car facing the road. Leave the keys in the ignition. I swung the car around in a wide arc, the tires spinning slightly in the loose dirt. I threw it into park, leaving the engine idling for a moment. My chest was tight, every breath requiring a conscious, agonizing effort. I turned the key backward to kill the engine, but I didn't pull it out of the ignition cylinder. The heavy metal ring of my house keys dangled from it, tapping softly against the plastic steering column. I sat in the driver's seat and waited. The silence of the lake was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of my car's engine block cooling down in the damp air. I stared at the dark, empty windows of the cabin. Were they already inside? Did Vincent send 2 men? Or 4? How long had they been standing in the dark, waiting for the trap to spring? 10 minutes later, the low, powerful hum of a German engine broke the quiet. I checked my side mirror. Thomas's pristine, dark grey sedan was navigating the final bend of the dirt road. He was driving entirely too fast for the terrain, the heavy tires kicking up violent sprays of gravel and mud that coated the lower half of his car. He pulled into the clearing and parked at a sharp, aggressive angle, cutting off the path to the cabin, but leaving my exit clear. He killed the engine and stepped out. He was still wearing his office clothes, the crisp blue dress shirt, the expensive slacks, the polished leather shoes. The juxtaposition of his sterile corporate attire against the rotting backdrop of the woods was jarring. He looked down at his shoes, entirely ruined by the mud, and let out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy canvas tool bag. I forced my hand to the door handle. It took 3 tries to pull it open. My fingers felt like thick, useless rubber. I stepped out into the cold air. The smell of the lake hit me immediately, a thick, muddy scent of decaying algae and wet bark. "Faye," Thomas said, slamming his car door. He didn't look angry, just thoroughly exasperated. He walked toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the dry ground around the porch. "Where is the water? Henderson said it was flooding out the front door." I swallowed the lump of bile sitting high in my throat. I stood near the trunk of my Honda, gripping the cold metal lip of the spoiler to keep my legs from buckling. "I don't know." I lied, my voice thin, almost completely carried away by the wind. Maybe it's pooling in the back, near the kitchen." Thomas stopped at the base of the porch stairs. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly. For a terrifying second, I thought he saw it. I thought he saw the absolute, abject terror radiating off me. I thought he would drop the tool bag, pull out a gun, and end this. But his arrogance shielded him. He didn't see a threat. He saw his anxious, incompetent wife who had dragged him away from his important work for a false alarm. Unbelievable. He muttered, shaking his head. "The old man is probably going senile. I drove 40 miles for a dry porch." "I'm sorry," I whispered. It was the truest thing I had said all week. I was so deeply, profoundly sorry for all of it. I should get the camera from the trunk, just in case there's internal damage we can't see out here." "Fine," Thomas said, turning his back to me. "I'll go check the kitchen pipes. Give me a second to unlock the deadbolt. It usually sticks in this weather." He walked up the 3 wooden steps. The old boards groaned loudly under his weight. He set the heavy tool bag down on the porch, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his keyring. I didn't move towards the trunk. I just stood there, my fingers digging into the cold metal of my car, and began to count. 1. Thomas jammed the brass key into the rusted deadbolt. He had to jiggle it aggressively, leaning his shoulder into the heavy oak door. The metallic scraping sound echoed off the flat water of the lake. 2. 3. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered. He hit the wood near the frame with the heel of his hand. The lock finally gave way with a heavy, satisfying clack. 4. 5. He pushed the door inward. It dragged against the warped floorboards with a prolonged, agonizing squeal. The interior of the cabin was pitch black. The heavy curtains were drawn across all the windows. It looked like the open mouth of a cave. 6, 7, 8. Thomas picked up his tool bag and stepped over the threshold. "Faye, it's bone dry in here," he called out. His voice was muffled, swallowed by the stagnant air inside. "Smells like mildew, but there's no standing water. Henderson is an idiot." 9, 10. "Just check the kitchen, Tom," I called back. My voice cracked violently on his name. I clamped my jaw shut. I couldn't say another word. 11, 12, 13. He stepped deeper into the cabin. The heavy oak door remained half open, casting a narrow, dusty rectangle of grey daylight onto the worn rug in the entryway. I couldn't see him anymore. I could only hear the heavy, confident thud of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor. 14, 15, 16, 15. The woods around me were completely still. The wind had died entirely. A single, fat drop of condensation fell from a pine branch and hit the hood of my car with a sharp tink. My heart was beating so violently against my ribs it felt like it was trying to crack the bone. My mouth tasted like copper and old pennies. 17, 18. "I can't even see the breaker box." Thomas's voice echoed from the back of the cabin. "It's too dark. I'm going to open the kitchen blinds." 19, 20. I heard the distinct, hollow sound of the tool bag being dropped onto the wooden kitchen counter. Then the world shattered. There was no cinematic monologue. There was no dramatic confrontation. It started with a sound I will never, ever forget. It was a wet, heavy, meaty thwack, identical to the sound a butcher makes throwing a slab of ribs onto a metal table. It was followed instantly by a sharp, confused yell from Thomas. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a high, panicked yelp of genuine surprise. "Hey, what the fa—" The word was cut off by the brutal, sickening sound of wood splintering. Something heavy crashed into the wall. The entire cabin seemed to shudder. 21, 22. My entire body locked in a state of primal, paralyzing horror. My brain was screaming at me to get in the car, but my legs felt like they were packed with wet sand. I stood frozen, gripping the spoiler, staring at the half-open door of the cabin. A heavy struggle was happening in the dark. I heard the sharp squeak of rubber soles gripping the floorboards. I heard an animalistic grunt. I heard the sickening sound of flesh hitting flesh, rapid and merciless. "Get off!" Thomas screamed. His voice was strained, breathless. The confident, arrogant accountant was gone. It was the sound of a man fighting for his life. "Who are you? Take my wallet, just—" Another heavy impact, a metallic clatter, like tools spilling out of a bag onto the floor. 23, 24, 25. I couldn't breathe. My lungs simply refused to expand. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face against my cold arm. "You are an accomplice." A dark voice whispered in the back of my mind. "You set the trap. You lured him. You are killing him." A sudden, terrifyingly loud crash erupted from the cabin. It sounded like an entire bookshelf had been ripped from the wall and thrown across the room. The wooden porch groaned under the displaced weight. Then a voice spoke from inside the dark. It wasn't Thomas. It was deep, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Hold his arm down. Keep him flat." "Faye!" Thomas shrieked. The sound tore through the quiet woods, jagged and desperate. "Faye, run! Run! They're in the house! Get in the car!" 26, 27, 28. Even then, at the absolute end, when he was pinned to the floor by men who were going to dismantle him, his first instinct was to tell me to run. The contradiction broke something fundamental inside me. He was a monster who murdered a man with a steel pipe. He was a liar. He was a sociopath. But he was also the man who made me scrambled eggs this morning. And he was using his last breaths to try and save me from the consequences of his own actions. "Faye!" The scream dissolved into a wet, choking cough. 29, 30. "Give my men 30 seconds after he steps through the front door, and then you get in your car, drive away, and you never look in your rearview mirror." The paralysis broke. The sheer, overwhelming instinct for survival overrode the trauma. I pushed off the back of the car, my boots slipping on the damp dirt. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat. Inside the cabin, the screaming suddenly stopped. It didn't fade out. It just ceased, replaced by a wet, heavy silence that was infinitely worse. I slammed the car door shut. The loud slam echoed across the lake. I reached for the keys dangling in the ignition. My hand was shaking so violently I couldn't grasp the plastic head of the key. My fingers battered uselessly against the metal column. "Come on," I sobbed, a pathetic wet sound in the stale air of the car. "Come on, come on." I grabbed my own wrist with my left hand, steadying my right enough to close my fingers around the key. I turned it violently. The Honda sputtered, choked, and then the engine roared to life. I shoved the gearshift into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires spun wildly in the wet dirt, kicking a spray of gravel against the front bumper of Thomas's pristine sedan. The car lurched forward, violently throwing me back against the seat. I didn't care about the potholes. I didn't care about the suspension. I took the dirt road at 40 miles an hour, the car fishtailing wildly around the first bend, away from the lake, away from the cabin, away from the silence. The woods blurred past the windows in streaks of dark green and brown. The steering wheel shook violently in my grip. I was crying now, not silent tears, but ugly guttural sobs that tore at my throat. I couldn't stop gasping for air. The smell of the old antifreeze from the heater made me nauseous. You never look in your rearview mirror. Vincent's command echoed in my skull. I stared dead ahead at the rutted dirt road. I fixed my eyes entirely on the patch of ground illuminated by my headlights, refusing to lift my gaze. I knew that if I looked in the mirror, I might see something I could never unsee. I might see a man stepping out onto the porch. I might see Thomas crawling through the dirt. The urge to look was a physical itch, a burning sensation at the base of my neck. I clamped my jaw shut and forced my eyes down. I hit the main paved highway without slowing down, the tires squealing in protest as they transitioned from dirt to asphalt. The sudden smoothness of the road felt surreal. I merged into the lane, passing an oncoming logging truck. The driver didn't look at me. I was just another car on a Friday afternoon. The world was completely normal out here. 10 miles down the highway, my right hand instinctively drifted toward the deep pocket of my raincoat. My fingers brushed the hard plastic of the burner phone. Call me when it's done. I pulled the phone out. The green screen was dead. I rolled down the driver's side window. The freezing wind whipped into the cabin, instantly drying the tears on my face, stinging my cheeks. I didn't dial the number. I didn't owe Vincent a confirmation. He had his men. They knew it was done. The girl. Carmine said softly. The waitress. She did this? He tapped the heavy ledger. Her name is Sadie. Roman corrected, his voice entirely devoid of its former hostility. And she's not a waitress anymore. She's family. Roman pushed the heavy oak door open and walked out into the crisp morning air. 30 minutes later, the massive metal doors of the warehouse rolled open. The floor was alive with the roar of forklifts and the shouting of drivers loading the morning freight. Roman walked across the concrete floor, the men nodding respectfully as he passed. There was no fear in their eyes today, only the solid acknowledgement of a leader in control. He climbed the metal stairs to the glass-enclosed office. When I finally turned onto my street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. The sprinklers were running at the Johnson house. A teenager was walking a golden retriever on the corner. I pulled into my driveway. There was no unmarked van parked 2 streets over. The shadows were gone. Roman walked over to the desk. He didn't say a word. He reached down, closed her laptop with a soft click, pulled her out of the chair, and kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss, right in front of the glass windows for the entire warehouse floor to see. When he finally pulled back, he rested his hands on her waist, a genuine, rare smile breaking across his face. "I handled it," Roman said. "The company is ours. The city is clean." He reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Now, I believe we have a payroll to approve, Miss Jenkins." Sadie smiled, resting her hands against the lapels of his suit. The monster was gone. In his place stood a king, and she was exactly where she belonged. "Yes, boss," she whispered. That is the end of Sadie and Roman's incredible journey. From a shattered restaurant chair to a corporate takeover, this waitress proved that sometimes the most dangerous men just need someone who isn't afraid to hand them a broom. If you loved watching Roman transform from a chaotic enforcer into a grounded protector and witnessing Sadie's absolute fearlessness, please hit that like button and share this video with your fellow Mafia romance fans. I stood in the center of the kitchen, entirely alone. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel safe. Vincent had won. He got his revenge, and he had used me to pull the trigger. Thomas had been a monster, hiding behind the mask of a boring accountant, bludgeoning men to death for money. But as I stood there, looking down at my trembling hands, knowing I had delivered my husband to his executioners and driven away while he screamed my name, the darkest, most terrifying truth finally settled into my bones. There were 2 monsters in this house, And now, I was the only one left. Faye escaped the cabin, but she can never escape the chilling reality of what she has become. In a world built on lies, betrayal, and buried secrets, the line between victim and monster is razor thin, and Faye has crossed it entirely. What would you have done in her shoes? Would you have warned Thomas or walked away just like she did? Drop a like if this dark, psychological thriller kept you on the edge of your seat. Share this video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell for more twisted stories. See you next time.